I am Tim Erlin, the VP of Product. I'm thrilled that you're joining us for a little bit of conversation around runtime AI governance on AWS. And I am joined today by Alexei Ivanow, who is the Worldwide Security and Identity Senior Partner Solutions Architect from AWS. He's here to help provide some context and some perspective from AWS as we talk about AI governance and AI control loop. So, welcome, Alexei. Thank you for joining me today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here, team.
Awesome. So let's get started. Whenever we do webinars like this, I always like to start with a little bit of context about the topic, the market, the problems that customers are experiencing. And this first slide, this is actually a statistic from a survey that AWS did, the AWS Generative AI Adoption Index from May of last year. And I think it's maybe evidence of our shifting mindset and how quickly AI is changing the landscape. That May of last year actually feels like a long time ago in the scope of AI. But I really, there's a lot of data in the survey, but I picked out one item that I thought was particularly relevant to this topic, which is that when asked to rank their budget priorities, 45% of organizations ranked generative AI as their top budget priority. Above security, security was the number two item in that list. You can see there with 30%. Um, and it's really interesting to see that organizations, budget is a place where you can sort of put your money on the table or put your money where your mouth is, if you like that expression. I think it's really interesting to see how organizations are prioritizing spending on generative AI, even above some of the security concerns that they might have or security projects they might have. Alexei, do you, in your day-to-day work with customers and partners, do you see evidence of this shift in budget priority, and what does that look like um, in the organizations that you have experience with?
Yes, team. That matches what we see on the AWS side. Most organizations have adopted AI in some form, but very few have structured governance around it. The adoption pressure from the business is real. Security teams are trying to catch up. When security teams tell you that they're doing AI security team, what does that usually look like in practice?
So it's a great question because I think the definition of AI security is pretty vague at this point. There are a variety of tools and capabilities out there. I think a lot of organizations don't know where to start. There are there is some guidance in the market, and we'll talk a little bit about AWS's guidance. But I
Right.
definitely see organizations trying to put in tools like an AI gateway as an example. Trying to put some kind of guardrails around the AI in their environment. But it's an ad hoc process at this point, from what I've seen. Does that match what you see as well?
Yes, and I think it requires some systematic approach, definitely.
Yeah. So the other metric or statistic that I wanted to put up here is from a an industry survey or it's another vendor survey basically that is about the AI risk or the risk that AI is bringing to the environment. And the statement here is that 80% of organizations have already experienced an incident involving generative AI. That surprised me, frankly. It's a incredibly high percentage. Now, having looked on the previous slide and your comment, Alexi, about most organizations using AI in some capacity, maybe it shouldn't be surprising because the threat landscape does exist. Organizations are adopting AI, and if you take a broad perspective of what an incident might be, I think you can get to that 80% number. Um, so it's not just that AI is being adopted, but that there is real risk out there. Do you see the people that you talk to, Alexi? Do you see them um, understanding that this risk exists, or is it still a challenge for organizations for security practitioners to educate their organizations about the risk that AI presents?
Well, I meet different people. Some of them really think that the classic security controls still gonna protect them. Some of them understand the challenges that AI
Mhm.
workloads bring. But from my perspective, team, the fundamentals of security haven't changed. Defense in depth still applies. What's new is there is a layer that didn't exist before, the AI application layer. Your infrastructure controls, your identity controls, those still matter. but they don't see a prompt injection because it looks like a normal HTTPS traffic. They don't flag when an agent exceeds its authorized scope. That's a new surface, and it's one that most teams don't have visibility into yet, unfortunately.
I think that's a really important distinction to call out that there's a difference between the security control and the implementation of that control. And so what it sounds
Yes.
like you're saying is that AI, the risk that AI presents doesn't really mean that we need brand new security controls, but we might need new implementations of the security controls that are already critical in order to deal with the new technology landscape that AI provides. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and speaking of security controls, I think when you work and design and implement those, you really need to answer a question like whether those controls make some capability unavailable during the attack, or they rather make an attack tedious. If it's the latter, you should try harder and rethink how you approach it because AI-powered attacks, they have like a lot of resources and time. So just creating a bottleneck wouldn't solve the problem.
Yeah, you're referring, I think, maybe not intentionally, but to there's an old saying or an adage that part of the job of security is to spend attacker resources or to make the attacker's job more expensive. But generative AI changes the resource equation so that maybe controls that just make it more expensive aren't really as effective as they used to be because the attacker can leverage AI to lower that cost.
That's right. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, interesting perspective. So I think, given those sort of two perspectives that we talked about, right, that organizations are adopting AI at a rapid pace. They're prioritizing budget, as we saw in the AWS survey around a generative AI. And the fact that there's a real threat landscape out there, 80% of organizations having experienced a generative AI related incident, that the conclusion we come to is that AI deployment is outpacing or has outpaced governance, that organizations are deploying AI, but they're not really capable of or able to, it's not capability, it's ability uh, to manage it or govern the AI that they're deploying. Uh, does that match what you're seeing with AWS, customers and partners as well?
Yes, there is certainly a gap, and we need to close this gap for sure.
Yeah. One of the ways that we can talk about closing that gap, I think, is with the AWS AI security framework. You mentioned just a minute ago that we really need a structured approach. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what that structured approach looks like from the perspective of AWS.
Yes, absolutely. That gap, speed without governance, comes down to three questions. First, what are you building? We see three use cases, each building on the previous. AI that answers, your AI generates responses from a model, no connections to external data or systems. Even here, prompts can leak what you didn't intend, and without governance, shadow AI spreads across the org. So you start by filtering inputs and outputs, controlling access and monitoring. The AI that connects, now your AI reaches into enterprise data, right? And every query becomes an access request. And if it returns data that users shouldn't see, your access model breaks silently. So you add data classification, fine-grained access, and output validation. Then AI that acts. And this is where it gets fundamentally different team. Agents making decisions, calling APIs, coordinating with other agents. One misconfigured agent repeats bad permissions at machine speed. So you give every agent its own identity, scope its permissions, and require human approval for critical actions. Each use case carries everything from the previous one forward. You don't start fresh when you move from a chatbot to an agent. You add layers. Second, where do those controls operate? This is defense and depth applied to AI. Three layers, each catching what the others miss. Infrastructure at the base. Is this environment isolated and hardened? Identity and data in the middle. Who is this and are they allowed? And with AI, this is now this now includes not human identities, right? And because agents need their own credentials, not a copy of human permissions. We really need to be careful here. And AI application at the top. Is what's happening at the model layer safe and intended? This layer is unique to AI, and traditional security doesn't inspect prompts or validate model output. And finally, third, where are you on your journey? Security compounds at each phase. You never start over. So with foundational, you're prototyping, you build security in on day one. These are configuration changes usually, not architecture changes. Then enhanced, you're moving to production. So you add threat detection and incident response. You need to know when something goes wrong and respond before it scales. And finally, with advanced, you're operating at scale. So you automate governance and enforcement. Manual processes don't survive here. And the core principle, you aren't adding security to AI. You are building AI on top of security. And this is where runtime governance fits. When you add AI that acts in the enhanced or advanced phase, you need continuous visibility into what agents are doing at runtime. Team, let's get into the how.
So let me ask you about this framework just to set the foundation a little bit. Is the intention that each layer is a mapping, so AI that answers maps to infrastructure security to foundational, or are they three separate layers to be interpreted separately?
The defense and depth layers apply to every use case, whether it's a agentic AI or just a chatbot answering questions, right? Because you want to think about it systematically in layers.
Yes.
So if one layer fails, then all other layers still provide meaningful protection.
So for each of the use cases, the three layers and three phases could be applied. Even if you only have AI that answers, you still would
Of
want to look at
course,
all three layers and all three phases.
absolutely. Yes,
Yeah.
that's
I
exactly
think
the
that's important.
systematic approach we've been talking about.
Yeah. I think it's also important to consider that AI that answers and AI that connects, both of those can potentially expose data or be exploited because the AI that answers still has data to share. It's just that it's been trained on it. It's not retrieving it dynamically. So they're not qualitatively, there's a different mechanism, but you can still have the same types of risks in both of them.
Yes, prompt injection is still a concern even for AI that answers.
Yeah, I think that's valid. And there's certainly a mixture of capabilities there across those use cases. So you might have an agent that retrieves data but also takes action, as one agent. And so it's the use cases are they can be blended.
Definitely.
Yeah, and all of that to me says supports the need for a systematic structured approach because frankly, AI deployments, the technology behind the AI implementations that organizations are adopting, it's complex and it's continuing to get more complex as vendors and the software offers more features to customers as well.
Yeah, and one of the biggest mistakes I see organizations do is they're trying to add security on top of AI workloads they already prototyped and built when they move to production, which should really cost them a lot of resources instead of if they just built the AI workloads on top of security with security
Yes,
built in from day one.
yep, I understand. That makes perfect sense. It's not always possible, but it does make sense. So
Yeah,
I want to layer on top of the framework from AWS, the AI control loop that WallArm supports and proposes with our products in market today as well. So from our perspective, it's important that you address these four capability pillars when you're looking to manage and control AI in your environment. Um, and I see this pattern, to be honest, anytime a new technology comes out and is adopted at a rapid pace, there's a pattern for how security gets a handle over time on that technology. So this applies to, if you go back to, containers or virtualization to cloud, the first place that organizations start is by understanding what they have with discovery, observing what it's doing with observe, and then enforcing policy, preventing bad actions in a variety of ways, and then ultimately ending up with governance, managing and tracking and ensuring compliance across that landscape of technology. And so that pattern applies to AI as well as we see organizations adopting AI at a rapid pace. We expect to see the same needs, certainly starting with that discovery. So we're going to talk about each of these individually and dive into the details and what good looks like for each of them before we get to some questions or an opportunity for questions. So just as
Yeah.
a side note, if you have questions, you can ask them in the Q&A function in Zoom. So please, as we go through this content, feel free to add questions and we'll address them at the end. Alexi, you were going to jump in and say something. I cut you off. I apologize.
Yeah. Tim, this is exactly how we think about security on AWS: visibility, monitoring, enforcement, and evidence. Same principles applied to AI. But here is the real test. Most teams think they already do all four. So ask yourself, do you have discovery for unsanctioned AI workloads? Can you observe what an agent decided, not just that it was invoked? Is enforcement operating on the model outputs in real time? Can you produce the audit trail today if asked by the auditors? If any of those is not yet, that's where to start. The good news, each step has native AWS services behind it, and partners like Wallarm complement at the runtime there. So yeah, team, let's go through them.
Yeah, let's talk about them. So to start with discovery, I think the problem set here is that you've got, as we talked about, you've got deployment that's outpacing governance. So engineers can stand up AI services without informing security that they're happening, that they're being deployed. You've got, rapid development across the AI landscape. You've got, agents that might be calling MCP tools that no one has reviewed. There's a variety of sort of process problems that the velocity of AI deployment has exploited, if you will, and resulting in this inability or likely inability to know what you have deployed. And that's a challenge for organizations. So when we talk about understanding what's deployed, I think there are multiple layers to consider, and it's important to understand that it's not just what agents do I have running or what models am I using. That's certainly a piece of it, but the infrastructure supporting those AI workloads is part of the puzzle as well. So we want to talk about, if you're talking about discovery, you want to also include the supporting infrastructure on top of which those AI workloads run. Do you have a clear understanding of all of the AWS accounts, VPCs, EKS, all the APIs, all the lambdas involved, the load balancers, et cetera, et cetera? That's part of that infrastructure that supports your AI workloads. And then the workloads themselves are not just an agent and not just an LLM, but the entire transaction that occurs. So there's a prompt that might start that transaction. It goes to an LLM or an agent. That agent would then maybe call other tools via an MCP server or directly over an API, might access data sources that it needs to accomplish that task. And of course, an agent could connect to another agent that it needs to further accomplish its task. So there's a cascading set of interactions that make up that AI workload. So being able to discover the entirety of those objects, agents, MCP servers, the model providers, the data sources, all of that is part of understanding what's running in your environment around AI. And Alexi, I know
Yeah.
that AWS has supporting tools here. How does AWS support these discovery needs?
Well, Tim, yeah. First of all, the question I get from security leaders is how many AI services are running in my environment right now? And most of them don't like the answer when they find out. So on AWS, Agent Registry catalogs the agents you built. CloudTrail captures every Bedrock and SageMaker invocation. For customers who standardize on AWS for their AI workloads, that's comprehensive visibility. The challenge comes when the teams also use external AI providers alongside AWS. That's where you need visibility at the network layer too. So, team, how does that show up when you look at a customer's environment?
So inside of Wallarm's AI hypervisor, so first of all, inside of Wallarm's infrastructure discovery offering, we provide cross-account visibility to all of the AWS resources that you have so that you can see what's running. We also offer the ability to detect changes, so seeing drift when a configuration changes. And then we also pull in Security Hub findings from AWS. So anything you're flowing into Security Hub, and we add the context of where those resources exist in the environment. So you can see what we call a blast radius of where a particular resource, what other things is it connected to? So context on top of the visibility that AWS provides there natively. And then the AI hypervisor offers that registry of all of those agents, LLM providers, MCP servers, data sources, anything that's flowing through Kubernetes and AWS will capture and display in that registry. So it extends the full visibility that AWS provides natively with some of those external pieces that you mentioned, Alexi.
Great. Yeah.
So
But
discovery is just the starting point, right?
it's a
Let's
step
talk
one. You
about
can't govern
step
what you
one.
can see.
That's
Yes.
right. So I think observability is important too. And really, this is maybe the most interesting part of the control loop to me, because I think discovery, finding things and creating a list of them, that's useful. Don't get me wrong, but it's not particularly unique. You can get other tools that will give you a list of things in your environment. But when you're talking about AI interactions, you're talking about, as I described, a prompt that kicks off a series of other connections that ultimately end up in some kind of a response. And a lot of the tools in the market that you have access to today only see part of that picture. That part of the picture might be important, don't get me wrong, but there are pieces missing. So in order to really observe what's happening with an AI workload, you need to see the start of the interaction with a prompt. You need to see what agent or LLM it connected to just for that prompt, and then all the other things it connected to. Did it get to an internal API? Did it go through an MCP server to get access to tools or resources? Did it access a database to pull some data back? Did it reach out to a specific LLM, and which one? Are there other services outside the environment that it connected to? Maybe that LLM is actually, outside of your environment entirely. And are you sending data out? So there's a completeness that I think is necessary to really check off the observe um, uh, step in the AI control loop. Um, so Alexei, let's talk a little bit about how AWS fits into that picture as well.
Yeah, I agree with you, team. And what's different about observing an AI is that a single user request can trigger a chain of actions, right? Model call, tool invocations, data retrieval, external API calls. On AWS, you have deep signals like CloudTrail for every API call, Bedrock invocation logs for model interactions, GuardDuty for anomaly detection. For agents built on Agent Core specifically, observability gives you the full session trace, which agents, which decisions, which tools, which data. The question for most organizations is, do all your AI workloads run through that instrumented path? For anything outside, self-hosted models, third-party AI services, cross-provider chains, that's where runtime observability at the network layer adds visibility. But seeing a problem and stopping it are two different capabilities. What good is the visibility if you can't enforce in real time?
So I appreciate the lead into the next step in the control loop. Very, very good. So we talked about discovery, we talked about observability, and to Alexi's point, the next step in that control loop is enforcement. And I think enforcement is a very broad term. Uh, and we're really talking with AI, it actually pushes it to more of a broad term. Often when we're talking about enforcement in the context of cybersecurity, we're talking about stopping attackers. And so you've got specific types of attacks that you might block, outside of AI. And that applies to AI as well. But with AI, there's also a policy angle to it. And there is the concern that I've heard from organizations, from prospects and customers, that you might have an AI agent that isn't doing something malicious, but is just doing something that's unapproved or outside of policy or creatively trying to solve a problem that a customer has put to it or a user has put to it. And so enforcement applies to both of those things. You've got enforcement for things like prompt injection, jailbreaks, that are clearly an attacker-driven interaction. And then you might have some things that fall into a gray area. So PII egress, for example. You've got sensitive data or personally identifiable data that's exiting your environment. Is it supposed to? Is it not supposed to? Is it malicious? Is it accidental? Putting policy in place and being able to stop that PII egress allows you to put some control over that. You can also have risky tool calls, things that fall outside of the standard of AI behavior that you might expect in your environment. And maybe they're okay, but maybe you want to block them and stop them as a means of reducing risk. So that policy-based blocking is important, and it has to be able to stop sessions instantly. So the ability to actually not just detect and log an event, but actually block it is part of the enforcement angle for the AI control.
Yeah,
Alexi, do you want to jump in there? Yeah.
we have a web application firewall. We are covered. I hear that a lot. But the WAF doesn't see prompt injection. It looks like normal HTTPS traffic. Enforcement for AI operates at multiple layers simultaneously. At the perimeter, WAF, like AWS WAF with the AI activity dashboard feature, it sees bot and agent traffic patterns. At the model layer, Bedrock guardrails filtering inputs and outputs on every invocation, catching prompt injection, reducing PAI, as you mentioned, as one of the concerns team. And at the identity layer, identity and access management scoping permissions per agent. And at runtime inside the cluster, that's where alarm, I guess, enforces based on behavior. So four layers, all enforcing independently. That's a defense in depth for AI.
Yeah, I think that this is a great example of where defense in depth, a great example of defense in depth, because you have this layered approach. And I think talking about some of the other controls is important. A WAF, as an example, just because the WAF doesn't see the AI interaction doesn't mean that it's not a valuable and valid control. It's doing exactly what its job is, which is protecting web applications. Um, and that's true for all of the controls in the layer. But that ability to connect the dots, if you will, and enforce behavior at runtime is a real advantage. And it's something that's material to AI. I think it's also important to mention the ability to connect those interactions back to the originating identity, which is part of that observability chain that I didn't talk about before. Because it, as you look at sort of a layered approach, the the user who started with the prompt can get lost through the multiple interactions that occur, and that context is valuable to the security practitioner. So being able to trace the entire interaction and map it back to that identity gives you the ability to understand where a an enforcement action further in the chain originated. And I think that's a valuable component of the AI control loop.
Yes, we definitely need to connect the dots.
Awesome. Okay. So last but not least in the AI control loop is governance or govern. And this is an interesting one to me because, uh, it's I talked a little bit about the pattern that we see with new technology, that starts with understanding what you have, discovery, that's the first place, right? I've got a new technology, I don't know what's out there. Moves to observability, what's it doing? And then to enforcement, how do I block bad things? Governance sort of comes last, and you could argue that it shouldn't come last, but it's really driven by the need to manage the entire system. And before you can manage that system, you kind of have to understand what's out there and how it's working. On the other hand, governance certainly has a tight relationship or is tightly coupled to compliance and regulatory standards as well. And we've seen regulatory efforts in technology and cybersecurity evolve over the years. So, whereas in the past you might have seen more reactive regulatory responses, the EU AI Act actually, was drafted a couple of years back before AI adoption really took off to where it is today, and aims to address some of those challenges with governance from a compliance angle, from a regulatory compliance angle. Now, not all of the EU AI Act is enforcement now, and there are potentially some changes around the dates of enforcement as well, but some parts of it are definitely in place. And so it becomes a challenge for organizations to understand uh, whether or not their deployed AI is under control, is it managed, is it governed, and how do the controls that you put in place map to the standards that are out there. And the EU AI Act isn't the only standard. I've put up here a mapping of other standards and how they apply to the steps in the AI control loop. GDPR is a good example of a standard that's existed for years, but applies to AI because AI deals with personal data and privacy. So GDPR still applies even though you've put a new technology on top of it. There are still some newer regulations like the Colorado one that are coming, and then of course there are voluntary standards, the NIST AI risk management framework, the ISO standard that apply to AI, but are designed not specifically for a regulatory compliance need, but for a other standards-based approaches. So I expect that the regulatory and standards environment for AI will continue to increase in complexity, and that organizations will need tools to help them manage that complexity. And that is part of the overall AI control loop that needs to be in place for organizations to govern AI. Alexi, what can AWS add to this equation or this conversation around governance?
On AWS, Security Hub CSPM gives you continuous compliance scoring against CIS, NIST, PCI DSS, right? CloudTrail gives you immutable audit trails. And Security Incident Response, one of my favorites, gives you case history and monthly reporting. That's your evidence foundation. WallArm complements with AI-specific evidence, which agent, which session, which data flow, which model provider was involved. That's the traceability layer regulators are looking for.
Mhm.
And the time to build that evidence trail is now, while you still have runway, because EU AI Act enforcement starts August 2026, right? So that's 2 months from now. The question for most organizations isn't whether they need governance evidence for their AI systems. It's whether they can produce it today if a regulator asks.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's important for if you're responsible for compliance in some way. I think it's really valuable to think about um, the controls and the audit in terms of, if you're talking about tools, does this tool provide a control? Does it validate that a control is in place, or does it support a control in some way, make it easier to use or easier to deploy? Because understanding that having a control is not the same thing as validating that control, as being able to prove that it's in place, is important from an audit perspective. And the validation, the requirements for validation are driven by those auditors. So if you are um, if you're worried about compliance, but you're not in a position where you have to comply with something, nobody's showing up to audit today. Now is the time to put in place the controls, and then the auditors can drive the validation of those controls as the regulations become enforceable. And you can do it doesn't have to be one step. It can be put in place controls today. CloudTrail is a great example, right? Anything that's collecting immutable logs, that's a control that applies across many different compliance
Right.
standards, IT compliance standards. Proving that you have the right logs can be a second step when an auditor shows up. That's the validation step that follows implementing the control. And so with AI, we're going to see that pattern where putting in place controls today is valuable, and then as the regulations and standards develop, augmenting those controls with the appropriate validation will become apparent as the auditors define what they're looking for and what format they need and that kind of thing as well.
Agree.
Awesome. All right, thank you. So we've gone through the whole control loop. Actually, I'm just going to do a little backward step here. So we've gone through the whole control loop on each of these steps, discover, observe, enforce, govern. We've talked about what's required at each step. We've talked a little bit about how AWS provides capabilities and how WallArm provides runtime visibility and runtime capabilities to augment what AWS provides natively. And that gives you a picture of the full loop that we're talking about. And really, the reason we do this webinar is because we believe that there's a better together story for AWS and WallArm. And I think, Alexi, do you just want to give a summary of the AWS role in, governing AI? We talked about the details, but what's the summary for folks?
Well, AWS is designed and built to be the most secure cloud to run your AI workloads. So we have a portfolio of services that we covered already partially during this presentation that help you to secure and monitor and observe and enforce, right, your AI workloads. But when you combine these layers, native AWS controls and runtime governance, What you get is the ability to move fast on AI without choosing between speed and security. That's the outcome. It's not about adding more tools. It's about each layer doing one job well so nothing falls through. Available on AWS Marketplace, I believe today we have this wall arm solution as well that complements what our native services provides and uh, help you to build even better AI workloads.
And I think on the wall arm side, you mentioned it, the runtime AI visibility, the inline enforcement, those are things that complement what AWS provides natively, that extend to some of the if you're using services that aren't AWS native, as you mentioned, Alexi, gaining some visibility there. There's a real story of combining the two to produce that outcome, and I love that you focused on that outcome. Our goal in partnership with AWS, that Better Together story, is to close that gap between deployment and governance, is to give organizations the ability to move quickly with AI and AI deployments, and also move securely and with governance as they develop. So I'm excited about the ability for customers to benefit from the combination. So with that, we've reached some final takeaways. So I always like to remind people, maybe you weren't paying attention to the webinar up until now. This is the point at which you should pay attention. These are the final takeaways. Start with discovery. I think, Alexi, you said it at the beginning. Uh, I've said it many times in other contexts. You can't secure what you don't know about. You can't govern what you can't see. So
Yes.
understanding what's your environment is the starting point.
Yeah. I think overall, one takeaway is to go answer those four questions we talked through: discovery, observation, enforcement, governance. Wherever you said not yet, that's your starting point this week
Mm.
to think about.
Yeah. And number two for me on observe of a takeaway, if you want to remember one thing about the observability piece, is that AI governance is about more than AI. I think focusing on just the LLM, just the model, just the agent, um, is a is a an easy trap to fall into, if you will. But when you deploy AI capabilities in your environment, you're deploying them on top of AWS infrastructure that is more than just the model. You're deploying tools, agents that connect to other tools, that use MCP servers to get to resources, that connect to data, that connect to APIs to take actions. And so that governance is not just about those AI specific pieces; it's about the whole picture. And it's important to think of that whole picture and understand what's there in order to achieve the AI governance you're after. On enforcement, uh, I think the real takeaway here for me is that detection is not enough. Detecting events, detecting policy violations, detecting attacks is only part of the puzzle. If you can't actually stop those attacks from happening, you're not doing the whole job. Detection is a requirement. It's a necessary but not sufficient requirement in order to accomplish AI governance, in order to complete that AI control loop.
And what's important is to have enforcement capabilities on multiple layers within your infrastructure. Getting back to this defense in depth, right?
Absolutely. That's right. That's right. Enforcement isn't a single point in the infrastructure of the process. Enforcement is an action that can be taken at multiple points across the layers. That's the defense in depth approach.
Starting with isolation on infrastructure and compute layer, then moving to identity and data protection, so least privilege, right? Uh, Defense in depth in a way like you should think about KMS keys that you use and the key policies. So even if something is compromised, the keys cannot be used within the workloads that are not supposed to be using these encryption keys. And finally, with AI protection layer of AI application, guardrails is a good starting point where you can
Yeah.
filter input and output and use even some proven algorithms like, for example, better guardrails, automated reasoning, where you can verify every answer, whether it's a hallucination or it's ground to some knowledge base or specific data that you have.
Yeah. We didn't talk about it in this webinar, and I don't want to, it could be a whole webinar by itself. But I think when people talk about defense in depth and they talk about all of the places that enforcement might exist at all those layers, it can be pretty overwhelming. and it can be hard to figure out where to start. And I think threat modeling is a great tool to use to figure out where to
Oh,
allocate
always.
your limited resources, right? You don't have to address every threat all at the same time. Figure out which of them are the most important or the most likely for your organization, and then go look at the controls that are there to help you address those threats.
I agree. Threat modeling definitely brings this systematic approach thinking that we mentioned multiple times through the webinar, answering those four key questions like what we are working on, right? What can go wrong? What can we do about it? And did we do a good job? Definitely helps you to understand your risk
Yeah,
portfolio, right? Perform risk assessments and think of remediation, mitigation techniques to address
yeah.
those risks.
The last takeaway, which sounds a little bit like a threat, compliance is coming. So you may not find that you're subject to compliance standards or regulations around AI today, but there can be no doubt that it's coming, and that the EU AI Act is sort of the tip of the spear. The reality is that you probably are subject to compliance. If you have AI that's interacting with PII in any way, you're probably subject to GDPR with some limitations. So take a careful look at what might apply today, but be aware that if you don't have an auditor knocking on your door today to talk about AI and compliance in your AI deployments, that it is coming, and now is the time to put in place the controls that you'll need in order to be compliant. All right. We do have a few questions. So that's the end of the presentation that we've prepared. There are some questions for us to answer. So I'm gonna go dig up those questions and ask them and see which of us can answer them. Um, and so if you have questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A. You still have time. And let's take a look at the list of questions. All right. So given that most companies are bolting on AI components versus being AI native built, leading to AI security being built around tech versus intertwined, what's your most common first step with clients? There are two questions here. So first of all, I think this person is going back to sort of your point, Alexi, that it's better to build AI on a secure foundation or a foundation of security than bolt on security after the fact. But the
Yes.
reality is that isn't always possible. So if you've got AI, companies adding AI components to existing infrastructure, what do you think is the first step they should take in terms of governance and security for those bolt-on components?
Yeah, I can take this one. Speaking of the first step, as far as I'm concerned, it should be visibility because most teams don't know what AI is running in their environment. So start by discovering what's there, sanctioned and unsanctioned, because you can secure what you can see, obviously.
And I think there's an important component there that if that AI is running in AWS native services, you've got AWS tools to find and discover what's there. And then if it's not, you with WallArm, you've got that runtime visibility layer to identify the things that aren't in AWS or native in AWS. And so you're creating sort of that complete picture, which I think is pretty valuable. Um, so discovery is a first step. I agree 100%. The second question I think is a little harder to answer, a little more challenging, which is how do you evolve to get security intertwined versus bolted on? And to me, that's more of an organizational process question than a technology question. I don't know, Alexi, if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, that's a very reasonable question to follow the previous one. I think that building security into the AI development lifecycle, not around it, is the reasonable next steps. That means guardrails at the model endpoint from day one, identity per agent from the first deploy, and not added after production. The framework core that we mentioned, like the principles that I talked about, right? You aren't adding security to AI. You're building AI on top of security, as you already summarized. So that
Mhm.
shift happens when security is in the pipeline, not reviewing after the fact. So keep adding those important AI security components into your pipeline, into your development lifecycle. That would be a reasonable evolvement on top of just bringing the visibility as a step one.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges I've seen with organizations is that, and it's amazing to me how this has happened, but that more and more organizations than with previous technology evolutions are willing with AI to sort of throw out their best practices in favor of velocity, in favor of a fast deployment and adoption, and that creates this challenge of, I've now deployed an AI capability and application, what have you, and I need to bolt security on because I gave up or I skipped. I accepted the risk would be the right way to put it of deploying it without the usual best practices. And so to me that, as I said, I feel like that's an organizational challenge of um, getting the senior leadership to understand the risks that exist, and then they can either choose to accept those risks or to do something to mitigate them. And the mitigation is what Alexi, you were talking about. Mitigating those risks can be building the security into the pipeline, into the development process, is one of those steps for sure.
Yeah.
So another question, a little bit related, but different, slightly different question is, what's the biggest challenge in controlling AI after deployment? I think there are probably a few challenges we could talk about, but from your perspective, Alexi, what do you think the biggest challenge in controlling AI after deployment is?
From my perspective, one of the biggest challenges is behavior changes without code changes. Traditional applications are deterministic. Same input, same output. AI agents adapt, they change decisions and produce different outcomes from the same prompt. You cannot write a static rule for that. So you need continuous monitoring of what the AI is actually doing at the runtime instead of just what it was designed to do in deploy time. So this monitoring behavioral analysis is really important to stay secure and make informed decisions whether something is going off.
Yeah, I agree with you, actually. I think that is probably the biggest challenge. Um, I'll give you an example, like a personal example of where that occurs. I built an agent to do a particular task. The task isn't important. And I asked that agent to sort of self-evaluate the ways that it could go wrong. And the first thing it came up with, which just sort of surprised me, was the number one first thing that it said could go wrong is I could just completely ignore your instructions. That was its assessment of risk. So in this case, the AI tool I was using assessed its own risk as just ignoring the instructions and doing something different. And so to your point about the outputs being non-deterministic, it is a big challenge because we often expect deterministic behavior, but the technology is specifically designed not to be deterministic, and that's going to result in unexpected behaviors at runtime. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. And
All
user
right.
input, it contains instructions as well as user requests, right? So basically, that's where all these new threats that we didn't think about before AI workloads come into play, like prompt injection, for example.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Let's see if we've got any other questions to answer. Let's see. I've got one here. How do organizations typically discover they have a shadow AI problem? Is it usually an incident that triggers it or proactive assessment? That's a valid question. By definition, if you have shadow AI, you didn't know it was there.
Yeah.
And so how do you find out?
I would approach it from two angles. For AI built on AWS, services like Agent Registry that catalogs what's sanctioned, Cloud Trails that we mentioned a million times already, shows every Bedrock and SageMaker invocation. So the delta is your unsanctioned AI within AWS. For AI usage outside of AWS, that's employees calling some third-party providers, right, and APIs directly. CloudTrail doesn't see that, but you need a network level visibility, like network firewall with TLS inspection on ingress, VPC flow logs or DNS logs. That's your visibility into what's going out of your network to figure out that something probably might be unsanctioned.
I want to point out the language you're using because although I fully expect that Wallarm's marketing will continue to use the term shadow AI, I actually don't like it that much. Um, it's not accurate enough. I like the term sanctioned and unsanctioned, and I think there's a third term, and we could debate what the right word is, but there's sanctioned, there's sort of known about, and then there's unsanctioned. So you've got, things that you specifically approve, things that you know are there and aren't approved, and things that you specifically prohibit. And I think that's a more accurate, detailed way of describing the quote unquote shadow AI problem than just saying shadow AI. But shadow AI is very good for marketing. All right. I think we've got a last question here. Let me just take a look and make sure I'm not missing any. Okay. So I think we've got a last question here. I always like this question, actually. It comes up in lots of webinars. Is there a quick win? Like, you're walking away from this webinar today. You want to do something. What could you do as a quick win, for AI governance? Alexi, what do you suggest as a quick win?
What I would personally recommend is to enable Bedrock guardrails on your model endpoints. It takes minutes to configure and immediately gives you input-output filtering, prompt injection detection, and PII reduction. So it works with Bedrock hosted models and external models for Agent Core Gateway. And that's the highest value single action for AI-specific security that doesn't change any design, changes or implementation changes. It's just a configuration click.
So I'm gonna do my job as a corporate spokesperson and say that my quick win recommendation is exactly what's on the slide here, which is to run Wallarm Infrastructure Discovery. It's available on the marketplace as a free trial or a free tier as well. It doesn't require that you install anything, and it gives you a picture of your AWS environment with some pretty interesting results. And so that's a great quick win and a good place to start as well. So with that, we're at the end of our time. Alexi, I want to thank you for joining us. I think it was a great webinar, really interesting content. I think the partnership between AWS and Wallarm is a strong, better together story for customers,
Yes.
and I'm excited to see where we can go with it. And I want to thank everyone else for joining us for the webinar as well. There will be a recording, so if you want to see it again or share it, you can. And feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.